You have sat in a seat at 31,000 feet. You have looked out of a porthole window at the black Atlantic below and felt, for a moment, that the world was impossibly small. You have drunk something cold from a plastic cup, tasted the recycled coolness of pressurized cabin air, and heard the low, steady hum of engines you trusted completely, because someone told you they were safe, and you believed them. For 64 years, that someone was American World Airways. That sound, 4 Pratt & Whitney turbofans pushing £250,000 of metal through the stratosphere, was not just an engineering achievement. It was a promise. A promise made in the same shade of midnight blue, from the same Globe and Wings logo, on the same tail, whether you were lifting out of JFK into a winter sky bound for Frankfurt, banking over the Pacific toward Tokyo, crossing the Caribbean toward Buenos Aires, or climbing north out of Nairobi. Pan Am was not an airline. It was a certainty. A fixed point in the world that Americans traveling abroad had trusted since 1927. In its heyday, Pan Am flew to 87 countries on 6 continents. It carried 11 million passengers a year. It employed 42,000 people across hundreds of cities. It built the first transatlantic jet service, invented the modern computerized airline reservation system, pioneered trans-Pacific commercial aviation, put the Boeing 747 into commercial service, and for more than 4 decades stood as the most recognizable airline brand on the surface of the earth. It was, in the language of the State Department cables that referenced it repeatedly through the Cold War, America's unofficial flag carrier. The blue globe on the tail was as recognizable a symbol of American power as the eagle on a passport. They survived the Great Depression, when federal airmail contracts kept the company alive by the narrowest of margins while other carriers folded around them. They survived the Second World War, flying 4 billion passenger miles in military service, losing aircraft to enemy action over the Pacific, retooling their entire operation from commercial carrier to military transport and back again. They survived the first oil crisis of 1973, which sent jet fuel prices through the roof, and reduced their fleet utilization to levels that would have destroyed a less resilient operation. They survived a string of leadership changes and boardroom revolts through the 1970s that saw 4 different chief executives attempt to stabilize a company visibly losing its competitive footing. They survived strikes, congressional investigations, FAA sanctions, and competitive pressure applied simultaneously from every direction. And then, on the morning of December 4, 1991, it was over. Not a slow fade, not a managed wind down announced weeks in advance with transition plans and media statements. A shutdown, immediate and total, announced to passengers standing at their gates by counterstaff who had known for less than an hour themselves. 7,500 people lost their jobs before breakfast. How does the airline that invented modern international travel end up filing for bankruptcy on a January morning in 1991, losing $3 million a day by autumn, and shutting every gate in every terminal with less than 24 hours notice? And what was truly happening inside the company, in the boardrooms and the hangars and the ticketing offices, and in the executive suites on Park Avenue, in the years before that final morning? Those are the questions this film answers. The answers are not what most people expect. One Terry Trippi was not what you would call a self-made man. His father was a New York banker and stockbroker. He attended Yale University. He had, by the standards of the early 1920s, every advantage that American society could arrange. But what separated Tripper from the other well-connected young men of his generation was not his education or his money. It was an absolute consuming obsession with aviation, and a willingness to bet everything on it repeatedly, long before it made financial sense to do so. He was born on June 27, 1899, in Seabright, Monmouth County, New Jersey. His first name Juan confused people for his entire life. Some assumed he was Hispanic. He was not. He was named after his great-uncle's Venezuelan wife, Juanita Terry, a woman he never met. Tripp graduated from Yale in 1920. He spent a brief, restless period on Wall Street at a brokerage firm, deciding within months that the financial world held nothing for him. What held him was the sky. He had learned to fly during the First World War, training as a naval aviator before the armistice ended his service before it began. After the war, he could not let the thing go. In 1922, Trippi set up a small air taxi service on Long Island, using 7 surplus Navy planes he had bought cheaply from the government. He called it Long Island Airways. He targeted wealthy men who lived out on Long Island and wanted to get into Manhattan quickly, which in the years before the expressway system was not a trivial problem. The planes were not elegant. They were ex-military, patched and repainted. But they flew, and his clients paid. And Trippi began to understand something that would define his entire career, that aviation did not need to be a novelty or an experiment. It could be a business, a real one. Trippi began to understand something that would define his entire career, that aviation did not need to be a novelty or an experiment. It could be a business, a real one. Long Island Airways did not survive. The market for wealthy air taxis was too narrow and too seasonal. But Trippi used it as a springboard. By 1925 he was involved in Colonial Air Transport, which secured a federal airmail contract for the route between New York City and Boston, one of the first such contracts issued by the U.S. government. It was a turning point. The federal airmail contracts were the lifeblood of early American aviation. They guaranteed revenue. They gave banks a reason to lend. They gave young airlines a reason to exist. But Trippi's vision was never domestic. From the beginning he thought internationally. He thought about ocean crossings, about connecting continents, about building something that had never existed before, a global American airline. The idea was not fashionable in 1925. The Atlantic had been crossed non-stop by Alcock and Brown in 1919, and Lindbergh would cross it solo in 1927, but scheduled commercial transatlantic service was viewed by most of the aviation industry as a distant theoretical ambition. Tripp was already working backward from the goal. In 1927, he merged several small interests, including his own, into a new entity called Pan American Airways. The original corporate shell had been created by a group of United States Army Air Corps officers, including then Major Henry Hap Arnold, who worried about German airline expansion into South America. Trippi spotted the structure, maneuvered himself into control of it, and redirected its purpose entirely. He recruited Charles Lindbergh. This bears emphasis. Lindbergh in the summer of 1927 was the most famous human being on the planet. Every major corporation in America wanted his name. He chose Trippi. He had met Trippi briefly in 1926 at Teterboro Airfield in New Jersey, when Lindbergh was still an obscure airmail pilot working for Robertson Aircraft Corporation. Something passed between them, a recognition of shared obsession. After his transatlantic crossing and the ticker tape parade down Fifth Avenue, Lindbergh came to work for Pan American as technical advisor, helping to survey routes across Latin America and the Pacific. With Lindbergh on its letterhead, Pan American was immediately viewed by the United States government as its preferred instrument for international aviation expansion. Every foreign airmail route that came up for bid went to Pan Am. The government did not advertise this as a policy. It was simply the reality. On October 19, 1927, Pan Am's first scheduled flight departed Key West, Florida, bound for Havana, Cuba. Trippi had rented a Fairchild FC-2 float plane for the occasion. The aircraft carried mail, not passengers. It covered the 90 miles in a little under 2 hours. The flight was, in every physical sense, modest. A single-engine float plane, a canvas mail bag, a 90-mile crossing between Florida and Cuba on a warm October morning. But Trippi had also done something on that first day that would define the company's entire relationship with government for the next 50 years. He had obtained from the Cuban government of President Gerardo Machado a landing concession at Havana that no other American airline held. He had maneuvered competitors out of the mail contract for the route. He had positioned Pan American Airways as the only American carrier with the authority and the infrastructure to operate the service. He would repeat this sequence, secure the exclusive, win the contract, exclude the competition on every major international route he opened for the next 4 decades. Nobody watching the Fairchild floatplane land in Havana Harbor on October 19, 1927, could have known what that aircraft represented. It represented the beginning of the most ambitious airline project in the history of commercial aviation. Through the late 1920s and into the 1930s, Trippi built Pan Am with a speed and aggression that startled even those who had backed him. He secured routes across the Caribbean. He pushed south through Central America, into Colombia, Brazil, and Argentina. By 1930, Pan American was the largest air transport company in the world, measured by route miles flown. The instrument of this expansion was the flying boat, specifically the great clipper ships that Pan Am commissioned from Boeing, Sikorsky, and the Glenn 50th, Martin Company. These were not aircraft in any sense that the word suggests today. They were ocean liners that happened to fly. The Martin, the 1130, which Pan Am put into Pacific service in 1935, had a wingspan of 130 feet and weighed 52,000 pounds fully loaded. It could carry 48 passengers on the San Francisco to Manila route, hoping through Honolulu, Midway, Wake Island, and Guam, a journey of 8,210 miles over 6 days. Passengers slept in proper berths. They ate from china plates in a dining saloon. The crew wore naval-style uniforms because Trippi insisted on the nautical tradition, calling his aircraft clippers after the great sailing ships of the previous century. On November 22, 1935, the China Clipper, registration NC 14716, built by the Glenn 50th, Martin Company of Baltimore, lifted off San Francisco Bay for Manila on the first scheduled trans-Pacific airmail service in history. Crowds lined the bay. A radio broadcast carried the departure live across the United States. The Golden Gate Bridge was still unfinished when the China Clipper passed over it. Trippi had been building toward this moment for nearly a decade. The Boeing 314 that followed the Martin boats was a step beyond anything previously imagined. Its 150-foot wing was derived from the experimental XB-15 bomber. Its 4 Wright twin Cyclone engines produced 1,600 horsepower each. The interior was divided into 5 passenger compartments, plus a main lounge with cocktail service, separate changing rooms for men and women, and a bridal suite in the tail section. On overnight Pacific crossings, the couches converted into beds. Food was served on china plates with silverware. The only class available was first class. In May 1939, Pan Am extended this service across the Atlantic, connecting Port Washington, New York, to Marseille in France via the Azores and Lisbon, the first regular transatlantic passenger service by any American carrier. A month later, the company launched regular passenger service on the same route. Pan Am effectively became an arm of the United States government during the Second World War, flying transport missions, training military pilots, surveying strategic routes across Africa and Asia, and converting its clipper routes to support the war effort. Between 1941 and 1945, Pan Am flew more than 4 billion passenger miles on behalf of the military. Several aircraft were lost to enemy action. The company absorbed the losses and kept flying. After the war, Trippi did what none of his competitors had the courage to do. He went to Boeing and ordered the jet. Pan Am took delivery of its first Boeing 707 on August 15, 1958. On October 26 of that year, the airline's 31st birthday, it launched the first transatlantic jet service in history, flying 123 passengers from New York to Paris. Trippi would later say that those 123 passengers flew into the future and found that it worked. The world of aviation had changed overnight, and Pan Am had changed it. The rest of the industry had no choice but to follow. Every major carrier was forced to order jets or be left behind. Pan Am had set the terms of competition for every international airline on Earth. Then came the 747. In 1966, Trippi walked into the Boeing factory in Everett, Washington, and told Bill Allen, Boeing's chief executive, that he wanted an aircraft twice the size of the 707. What the industry now needed, Trippi argued, was not speed. Supersonic aircraft were already being designed by both American and European manufacturers, but volume, cheaper seats, more people on each flight. The democratization of international travel, a crossing from New York to London that a middle-class American family could afford. Not just a diplomat or a corporate executive or a film star. Allen agreed to build the aircraft on the condition that Pan Am agreed to buy it first. The terms of this arrangement were understood on both sides as a gamble of the highest order. If the 747 did not sell in sufficient numbers, Boeing would face financial ruin. If it did not fill efficiently on Pan Am's routes, Pan Am would face a cost crisis. Both men signed. Trippi ordered 25 aircraft. The program cost Boeing more than $2 billion to develop, a sum larger than the company's entire net worth at the time. The 747 entered commercial service on January 22, 1970, on Pan Am's New York to London route. The aircraft held 374 passengers in a standard configuration, with a distinctive upper deck lounge that became one of the most evocative spaces in the history of commercial travel. The 747 entered commercial service on January 22, 1970, on Pan Am's New York to London route. The aircraft held 374 passengers in a standard configuration, with a distinctive upper deck lounge that became one of the most evocative spaces in the history of commercial travel. A curved bar where passengers could sit with a drink at 35,000 feet and look at the curve of the earth through small oval windows. First-class passengers on overnight crossings were served dinner with tablecloths and cutlery. The service had been reduced slightly from the Clipper flying boat era, but only slightly. A Pan Am transatlantic crossing in 1972 remained, by any measure, an occasion. At its operational peak in 1970, American World Airways flew to 86 countries and served 11 million passengers a year. Its Clipper-class cabins set the standard for international premium service. Its stewardesses, the company retained that word long after competitors had moved on, were among the most carefully selected and extensively trained in the industry. Their uniforms were designed by Edith Head, the Hollywood costume designer who had dressed Grace Kelly, Audrey Hepburn, and Elizabeth Taylor. Their training included language instruction, diplomatic protocol, emergency medical procedures, and several months of probationary service before final qualification. A Pan Am flight was not just transport. It was a statement. When you boarded a Pan Am Clipper, a former senior flight attendant, Janet Thomas, recalled in a 1997 interview, you were expected to feel that you had arrived somewhere important, even before you landed. That was the whole idea. The aircraft was the destination. The company's headquarters at 200 Park Avenue in Midtown Manhattan. The 59-story Pan Am building, designed by Walter Gropius, Pietro Bellusci, and the firm Emery Roth & Sons, completed in 1963, stood astride Grand Central Terminal, like a monument to that idea. It was, at its opening, advertised as the largest commercial office building in the world by floor area. Its facade displayed a 15-foot Pan Am logo and 25-foot globe symbols visible from most of Midtown. New Yorkers had argued about the building since the day the plans were published. It blocked the view up Park Avenue, cut the light, overwhelmed the surrounding architecture. But no one could argue it was invisible. Pan Am was not in the business of being invisible. The company even put a helipad on the roof. For 3 years between 1965 and 1968, and briefly again in early 1977, New Yorkers could take a helicopter from the roof of the Pan Am building to John F. Kennedy International Airport in 9 minutes. The service ended permanently on May 16, 1977, when a helicopter's landing gear failed, and the aircraft rolled sideways on the roof, killing 4 passengers waiting to board and 1 pedestrian on the street below when rotor debris fell from the building. It was a harbinger, in miniature, of the spectacular disasters that awaited the company on a larger scale. Juan Trippe retired as president and chief executive in 1968. He left behind the most powerful commercial airline ever assembled under a single flag. He died on April 3, 1981 in New York City. He did not live to see the full extent of what came next, but he lived long enough to watch the company he had built spend his final years selling its own furniture to pay the rent. What he had built, and what would prove impossible to save, was an airline constructed around a specific and fragile premise that the United States government would continue to treat it as a protected national instrument indefinitely. Everything that followed the day that premise was removed would be the story of a company discovering, slowly and at enormous cost, that the foundation had been built on an assumption rather than bedrock. Pan Am had been built on a specific condition: that the United States government would protect its international routes from domestic competition. This was not a written guarantee. It was an operating assumption built into every financial model the company had run since 1927. The government had effectively granted Pan Am a monopoly on most international routes in exchange for its willingness to serve as an instrument of American foreign policy. Pan Am pioneered routes that were strategically important, not just commercially attractive. It flew to countries where the State Department wanted an American presence. It carried diplomatic pouches, and sometimes diplomatic personnel. It was, as several government officials would later confirm on record, treated as the chosen instrument of American international aviation. Pan Am pioneered routes that were strategically important, not just commercially attractive. It flew to countries where the State Department wanted an American presence. It was, as several government officials would later confirm on record, treated as the chosen instrument of American international aviation. Because Pan Am flew only internationally, it had no domestic route network. It could not, under the regulatory structure that existed before 1978, operate flights within the United States. If you were flying from Kansas City to Paris, you flew a domestic carrier, TWA, United, American, to New York or another gateway city, then transferred to Pan Am. Pan Am collected its fare from New York onwards. The domestic carrier collected the rest, and crucially built a relationship with that passenger from Kansas City that Pan Am never had. This was fine when Pan Am had near-exclusive access to the international routes. It became a catastrophe the moment those routes were open to competition. The process began before deregulation. Gradually. Through the 1960s and into the 1970s, the Civil Aeronautics Board began approving competing applications on some of Pan Am's most profitable corridors. TWA received expanded transatlantic authority. American began flying to Europe. United was granted Pacific routes to Tokyo and Hong Kong. Slowly, the moat around Pan Am's international empire began to drain. Juan Trippe had seen this coming. His solution was to keep ahead of competitors through aircraft innovation. The 707, then the 747. A larger, faster, more efficient aircraft could always undercut a competitor's unit costs, at least temporarily. The strategy worked, repeatedly, through the 1950s and 1960s, and Trippe was not wrong to pursue it. He was right. It simply could not compensate, indefinitely, for the structural disadvantage of having no domestic feeder network. While American, United, and TWA could fill their transatlantic flights from their massive domestic hubs, collecting passengers from hundreds of American cities, funneling them through Chicago, or Dallas, or Los Angeles, or Atlanta, Pan Am was dependent on passengers who arrived under their own power at John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York. Every passenger who chose a domestic carrier's transatlantic service was a passenger Pan Am could not reach. Every time United flew a Denver family to London on a single ticket, Pan Am lost not just that sale, but the relationship that came with it. When Juan Trippe handed over control to Harold Gray in 1968, and Gray handed over to Najib Halaby in 1969, and Halaby gave way to William Sewell in 1971. This structural weakness was fully understood by each successor. What none of them managed to do was fix it. The first oil crisis of October 1973 hit Pan Am with particular violence. The Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries declared an embargo that caused the price of jet fuel to rise dramatically within weeks. Pan Am's fleet of 747s, magnificent, enormous, expensive to operate, suddenly became a liability rather than an asset. Each aircraft burned enormous quantities of fuel per flight hour. When fuel was cheap, the 747 size was its competitive advantage. When fuel prices tripled, that size became a crushing, unevenly distributed cost that fell heaviest on the carrier with the highest proportion of wide-body aircraft in its fleet. The company cut routes. It reduced its workforce. It retired older equipment. It took losses that management described as temporary and cyclical. They were neither. By the late 1970s, Pan Am had been losing money on its airline operations for the better part of a decade. The only reason the balance sheet looked survivable at all was the Intercontinental Hotels chain, which Pan Am had built up since the 1940s as a separate profit center operating in strategic cities worldwide, and the real estate income from the Pan Am building on Park Avenue. The hotels were profitable. The building generated reliable lease income. The airline was bleeding. The passengers who flew Pan Am through the 1970s mostly had no idea. The aircraft still gleamed. The service was still impeccable. The midnight blue globe still appeared on the tail, still visible from the gate while you waited to board. Whatever turbulence existed in the executive suites at 200 Park Avenue was invisible at 31,000 feet. Then Congress passed the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978, and the turbulence came down to earth. President Jimmy Carter signed the Airline Deregulation Act into law on October 24, 1978. The legislation eliminated federal control over airline routes and fares, disbanded the Civil Aeronautics Board over a 4-year transition, and allowed any certified carrier to fly any domestic or international route it chose. For airlines built on a model of price competition and domestic efficiency, Southwest, Frontier, People Express, deregulation was a gift. They could now go anywhere, price aggressively, and take market share from carriers that had grown complacent behind protected walls. For Pan Am, deregulation was the moment every structural weakness in the company became simultaneously, explosively visible. Without route protection, Pan Am's international corridors were immediately exposed to domestic carriers with feeder networks, lower cost structures, and higher load factors. United could now fly from Denver to London, collecting passengers all the way from Colorado. American could offer New York to Paris fares that undercut Pan Am, because American's Dallas-Fort Worth hub gave it a domestic revenue base that subsidized the transatlantic fare. Pan Am had no such subsidy available. What almost nobody knew at the time was that Pan Am's management had seen deregulation coming for 3 years before it happened and had failed to develop a credible strategic response. The company's internal planning documents, later reviewed by industry analysts and described in aviation histories, show that Pan Am's senior leadership understood the domestic feeder problem in detail. They could model the revenue impact. They could project the competitive pressure. They simply could not agree on what to do about it, and the indecision of those years cost them the preparation time they needed. The new low-cost domestic carriers compounded the pressure from a different direction entirely. People Express, launched in 1981 from Newark Airport by Donald Burr, was offering Newark to London fares that were a fraction of Pan Am's lowest transatlantic price. This was not the refined competition of British Airways or Lufthansa, who at least matched Pan Am's service levels. This was a bus service with wings, and it was taking passengers. Pan Am's cost structure, its union contracts, its aging fleet, its legacy overhead accumulated over 50 years of operation, could not be reduced quickly enough to compete on pure price. without destroying the premium service that was the only remaining reason many passengers flew Pan Am at all. The solution that Pan Am's board eventually approved was the acquisition of National Airlines. National was a Miami-based carrier with a strong domestic network across the American South and Southeast. It flew routes from Miami to New York, to Los Angeles, to Atlanta, to New Orleans, and to Houston. It had a loyal passenger base, a profitable business model built around the Florida leisure market, and a modern fleet that included Boeing 727s and DC-10s. If Pan Am could absorb National's domestic network, it would at a stroke acquire the feeder system it had always lacked. A passenger from Memphis could board National in Memphis, transfer to a Pan Am Clipper in Miami, and fly on to London or Frankfurt or Buenos Aires on a single itinerary. This was the vision. The problem was the price. National's shareholders and management knew precisely how badly Pan Am needed them. Eastern Airlines competed aggressively for National in the bidding. The final acquisition cost, approved by William Sewell in late 1979 and confirmed by the board, was $437 million, a figure that aviation analysts called too expensive from the day it was announced. The acquisition required Pan Am to take on substantial additional debt at a moment when the Federal Reserve under Paul Volcker was raising interest rates aggressively to combat inflation. The cost of servicing debt that might have been manageable in 1975 was punishing by 1980. And the acquisition came at the precise moment when the second oil crisis, triggered by the Iranian Revolution of 1979 and the outbreak of the Iran-Iraq War in 1980, sent jet fuel prices spiking for the second time in 7 years. The National Airlines integration was also far messier than Sewell had projected. The two carriers had different aircraft types, different maintenance procedures, different union contracts at different wage scales, different reservation systems, and deeply different corporate cultures. National's employees did not want to work for Pan Am. Pan Am's management did not fully understand National's operation. The promised synergies, the domestic feed flowing into international departures, the cost savings from combined operations materialized slowly, partially, and at far greater expense than Sewell's presentations to the board had suggested. Pan Am reported a profit of $80.30 million in 1980. But that profit existed entirely because the company had sold its own headquarters building at 200 Park Avenue to the MetLife Insurance Company for $400 million. One Wall Street analyst quoted in Time magazine in February 1982 put the situation with characteristic bluntness. It might have been better to sell the airline and keep the building. Nobody in the executive suite was laughing. Within a year of the National acquisition closing, Pan Am was losing $1.30 million every single day. In the first quarter of 1981, the company posted a loss of $14.50 million. In January 1982, Sewell was asked to retire, 18 months ahead of schedule. He was 63 years old. The board had reached what it described as mutual consensus that he must go. He went. He collected his pension. The airline he left behind was, as one company official described it privately, something of a mess. That was the understatement of the decade. Edward Acker arrived as chairman in September 1981. His brief was simple: stop the bleeding. He understood correctly that the first step was to cut costs and raise cash. What he chose to cut and what he chose to sell would define the trajectory of Pan Am's final decade. Edward Acker was a careful, methodical man. He had run Air Florida before joining Pan Am, and he had a reputation for financial discipline that the company desperately needed. He arrived with a plan, and for the first 2 years the plan made sense. He renegotiated labor contracts, he reduced headcount, he streamlined routes, he restructured debt. By 1983 and into 1984, there were signs, fragile, conditional but real, that the company might survive its decade of losses and emerge as something sustainable. He also sold what could be sold. In 1981, as part of the building sale to MetLife, Pan Am had vacated its iconic Manhattan headquarters and moved operations to Miami. The 59-story tower at 200 Park Avenue with Pan Am's letters visible across Midtown no longer belonged to them. MetLife continued to display the name for a decade. The sign was too large and too expensive to remove immediately, but the building was gone. Then ACA sold the Intercontinental Hotels chain. Pan Am had built Intercontinental from nothing in the 1940s, establishing luxury hotels in strategic cities worldwide as part of its vision of the complete travel service. By the mid-1980s, the chain operated 100 hotels in 52 countries and was genuinely profitable. Selling it meant eliminating one of the company's last reliable sources of income outside the airline. ACA sold it anyway, in 1981 because the cash was needed now, and the hotel's long-term value could not pay this month's fuel bill. Then, on April 22, 1985, came the sale that shook the aviation world. ACA called Richard Ferris, the chief executive of United Airlines, and offered to sell Pan Am's entire Pacific division. All of it, the routes across the Pacific to Japan, Hong Kong, the Philippines, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, and the South Pacific, plus 11 Boeing 747 SPs, 6 Lockheed L1011-500S, a single DC-1030, and 2,700 employees, plus 11 Boeing 747 SPs, 6 Lockheed L1011-500S, a single DC-1030, and 2,700 employees. The routes that Juan Trippi and Charles Lindbergh had surveyed by flying boat in the 1930s, the routes of the China Clipper, the routes that Pan Am had pioneered at a cost of 500,000 survey miles before carrying a single paying passenger, sold for $750 million to a competitor. The deal was announced at a joint press conference. It was, as the Washington Post reported, the biggest transaction in the history of civil aviation. ACA described it not as a retreat, but as a strategic consolidation. Pan Am would focus on the Atlantic, where it was strongest, while United absorbed the Pacific. Joseph Hale, Pan Am's North Pacific Region Director, who had worked the Pacific routes for more than 2 decades, told reporters simply, "It's almost unimaginable that there could be Pacific aviation without Pan Am." The Clipper era on the Pacific ended quietly in February 1986, when the last Pan Am flight departed Tokyo Narita. Airport workers and a handful of loyal passengers held a small ceremony. 50 years of unbroken Pacific service ended without ceremony from the company that had created it. $750 million went into Pan Am's accounts. The debt burden was reduced. The bleeding slowed. Then 1986 ended, and 1987 began, and the losses resumed. Because selling assets produces cash, not income. And Pan Am had now sold its headquarters, its hotels, and its Pacific operation. What it had left was the Atlantic, a domestic network built on national airlines routes that never properly integrated with the international service. An aging fleet, including 727s, that would not have been competitive in the mid-1970s, let alone the mid-1980s, and a cost structure that remained higher than almost every competitor in the industry. In September 1988, Thomas George Plaskett arrived as chairman and chief executive. He was 44 years old, born in Kansas City, Missouri. On Christmas Eve 1943, he had attended Raytown Senior High School, earned an engineering degree from General Motors Institute, then an MBA from Harvard Business School. He had spent 12 years at American Airlines, where he had been instrumental in creating the AdAdvantage frequent flyer program, the first loyalty scheme of its kind in the industry, and had developed the advance purchase discount fare structures subsequently adopted by every major carrier in the United States. He was widely regarded as one of the most genuinely talented executives in American aviation. He walked into a company that was not recoverable by talent alone. Plaskett spent his first weeks reviewing the numbers. What he found was an airline hemorrhaging cash at a rate that required immediate action on multiple fronts, simultaneously. He spent November and December of 1988 in intensive negotiations with Pan Am's 5 labor unions, the Airline Pilots Association, the Association of Flight Attendants, the International Association of Machinists, and 2 others, attempting to secure $180 million in wage concessions. He succeeded. The unions agreed, though not without difficulty. It was, as Plaskett would later describe it in public statements, enough to get the airline through what would become the harshest winter of its history. He had no idea yet how precisely and literally that phrase would prove to be. On December 21, 1988, Pan Am Flight 103, the Boeing 747 registered N739 PA, named Clipper Maid of the Seas, departed London Heathrow at 6:25 in the evening, bound for John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York, with 243 passengers and 16 crew on board. Among the passengers were 35 Syracuse University students returning home from a semester abroad. At 7:03 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, at an altitude of 31,000 feet, just north of the English-Scottish border, a bomb detonated in the forward cargo hold. The bomb had been hidden inside a Toshiba radio cassette player, packed inside a brown Samsonite suitcase, loaded in an unaccompanied bag at Frankfurt Airport. The explosive was Semtex, manufactured in Czechoslovakia, supplied by Libya. The timer had been set. When it fired, the plastic explosive punched a hole in the fuselage, and the aircraft tore apart at cruising speed. The nose section, containing the cockpit and the forward first-class cabin, separated from the fuselage and fell intact for several miles before striking a field near the church at Tundergarth, 3 miles east of the town of Lockerbie in Dumfries and Galloway, Scotland. The main body of the aircraft fell onto Sherwood Crescent in the town itself, destroying 11 houses and killing 11 residents where they stood, sat, or slept. The wings, heavy with fuel, created a crater 155 feet wide. A fireball was visible from 30 miles away. All 259 people aboard the aircraft were killed. All 16 crew members. All 243 passengers. 190 of them were Americans. 270 people died in total, from 21 countries. The wreckage was scattered over 845 square miles of southern Scotland and northern England, the largest crime scene in the history of the United Kingdom. More than 5,000 responders, including FBI investigators and Scottish police, recovered 319 tons of wreckage over the following months. The detail that never made the front pages, but which would haunt Pan Am's legal position for years, was this. 16 days before the bombing, the United States Embassy in Helsinki, Finland, had received a telephone warning that a bomb would be placed on a Pan Am flight out of Frankfurt. The warning was passed to the State Department and to the FAA. A security bulletin was issued. But Pan Am's own security procedures at Frankfurt, the ones that were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of attack, had 19 specific failings that the Federal Aviation Administration would later identify and fine the company for. The bomb got on board. Pan Am paid more than $350 million in compensation to the victims' families over the following years. It paid an FAA fine. It paid its own legal costs. It faced a reputational catastrophe that no amount of crisis management could contain. Within weeks of Lockerbie, bookings on Pan Am's transatlantic routes dropped sharply. Passengers who had always flown Pan Am to London, Frankfurt, or Paris began checking whether British Airways, Lufthansa, or KLM flew the same route. Many of them found that the competitors did. Many of them switched and did not come back. I remember standing at the check-in at JFK in January 1989, a former Pan Am gate agent named Michael Harrington said in a later account, and looking at queues that should have been 40 people deep and seeing 8 people. That was when I understood what had happened. Not to the passengers on that flight, to all the other passengers. They just decided not to fly with us anymore, and you couldn't blame them. Through 1989, Pan Am's load factors, the percentage of seats filled on each flight, declined steadily. The company's losses, which Plaskett had temporarily narrowed through the union concessions, widened again. A cash injection of $150 million from lenders in early 1989 bought time. It could not buy passengers back. The FAA fine that followed the investigation into Pan Am's Frankfurt security procedures underscored the severity of what had happened. 19 specific failings had been identified. The airline had received a specific warning about a bomb threat on a Frankfurt-originating Pan Am flight 16 days before the attack. Procedures existed that, properly applied, might have intercepted the bomb. Those procedures had not been properly applied. The regulatory fine was, in financial terms, a small fraction of the overall cost. The reputational cost was incalculable. Investigators from the FBI and Scottish police worked the Lockerbie case for years. The wreckage had been scattered across 845 square miles. More than 5,000 responders had combed Scottish farmland for months. The reconstruction of the bomb mechanism, the Semtex charge, the Toshiba radio cassette player, the Samsonite suitcase, required forensic work of extraordinary precision. Libya was ultimately identified as responsible. 2 Libyan intelligence agents, Abdel Basset Ali al-Megrahi and Lamin Khalifa Fima, were indicted for murder in 1991. The UN imposed sanctions on Libya in 1992. Pan Am Airlines had ceased to exist 12 months before the sanctions arrived. The families of the 270 victims from 21 countries, including 189 Americans, including 35 students from Syracuse University, returning home from a semester abroad, carried the weight of Lockerbie in a way that outlasted the airline by decades. For them, Pan Am's bankruptcy was not the story. The story was something else entirely, and it has never fully been resolved. In 1990, the Gulf War began. When Saddam Hussein's army crossed the border into Kuwait on August 2, 1990, and the United States military began assembling the coalition that would expel them, jet fuel prices spiked again. International leisure travel, the transatlantic business that was now Pan Am's primary revenue source, collapsed. Americans did not want to fly to Europe during a Middle Eastern conflict. The travelers who did were not flying Pan Am. By the end of 1990, Pan Am was losing money at a rate that could not continue for more than a few months. The company had no significant assets left to sell. The intercontinental hotels were gone. The Pacific routes were gone. The headquarters building was gone. The national airline's domestic network, which had never properly integrated with the international operation, had cost the company $914 million in accumulated losses between 1980 and 1987 alone, and had delivered almost nothing of what Sewell had promised when he agreed to pay $437 million for it in 1979. Thomas Plaskett filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection on January 8, 1991. He described it publicly as the start of a new ballgame, an opportunity to restructure, emerge smaller but viable, and compete effectively on a reduced route network centered on Miami. He was trying, at this point, to save something. The plan involved a critical deal with Delta Airlines. Delta, profitable, well-run, operating from its Atlanta Fortress hub, agreed to acquire the most valuable assets Pan Am had left: the transatlantic routes to Frankfurt, Paris, London, and beyond, the Pan Am shuttle, which served New York, Boston, and Washington, dozens of aircraft and spare parts, and a 45% stake in a reorganized, smaller Pan Am. The deal, approved by bankruptcy judge Cornelius Blackshear in August 1991, was worth $1.39 billion. It was the largest transfer of airline assets in American aviation history. Pan Am relaunched on November 1, 1991, as a smaller carrier focused on Miami international routes. The Globe logo was still on the tail. The Clipper name was still on the aircraft. There were people within the company who believed, genuinely, that something had survived. Delta had agreed to fund the reorganization. Without that funding, the new Pan Am could not operate. On December 2, 1991, Delta told Pan Am it was withdrawing its financial support. The reason Delta gave was that the new Pan Am was losing money faster than projected. The carrier had relaunched in November 1991 into the worst possible environment, fuel prices still elevated from the Gulf conflict, bookings still depressed post-Lockerbie, competition on every remaining route still fierce. Delta's financial people had run the numbers and concluded that continuing to fund Pan Am's operations was not recoverable. Without Delta's funding, Pan Am had no cash resources. None. The accounts were empty. On the morning of December 4, 1991, the decision was made. It was a Wednesday morning. Across the United States, passengers were standing at Pan Am gates with tickets in their hands, waiting for flights that would never board. At Dulles International Airport in Washington, D.C., people waited for a shuttle to New York. They flashed their tickets at the counter. The Pan Am agents behind the desk had known for less than an hour. They explained, as carefully as they could, that the flight was not going to carry passengers today, that the company had ceased operations, that the tickets, purchased in good faith, were now worthless pieces of paper. Some passengers argued, some wept, some simply sat down and stared at the closed check-in desks. The same scene played out simultaneously at every Pan Am counter in the United States and at Pan Am desks overseas, in Frankfurt, in London Heathrow, in Barbados, in San Juan. Passengers were stranded mid-journey with no way forward, holding tickets that were now financial instruments backed by nothing. Other airlines scrambled to assist. TWA and Delta extended credit to Pan Am passengers who had no way home. Some travelers paid twice for journeys they had already paid for once. Aircraft were abandoned at gates with fuel in their tanks, meals in their galleys, and cabin crew who had reported for duty that morning without any idea this day would be their last shift. Maintenance staff received calls asking them not to come in. The last flight in Pan Am's 64-year history was a Boeing 727-221, registration N368PA, named Clipper Goodwill. It had been delivered to the airline in May 1982. On December 4, 1991, it was operating flight PA 436 from Bridgetown, Barbados, to Miami International Airport, the same Caribbean corridor where the company had flown its first flight in October 1927. Captain Mark Pyle commanded the aircraft. His first officer was Robert Knox. His flight engineer was Chuck Foreman. They flew a nearly empty aircraft north through the Caribbean sky, and when they touched down at Miami International Airport at approximately 10:45 p.m. Eastern Time, airport fire trucks lined the taxiway and gave the aircraft a traditional water cannon salute. Thousands of Pan Am employees had come to the airport. Many were in tears. Not for the company. By that point, after years of uncertainty, the company's end was not a surprise to anyone inside it. They were crying for what the company had been, for the version of it that had been young and powerful, and had meant something specific to them. The training that had turned you into someone who could operate at the highest level of international aviation. The pride of carrying a blue globe bag through an airport and having strangers recognize it. The strange sense that you were part of something larger than your job description. Russell the 50th. Ray Jr., who had been handed the title of President and Chief Executive in the final chaotic weeks, issued a prepared statement. Today we see the end of an airline whose name will be forever forged in American history. Approximately 7,500 people lost their jobs on that Wednesday morning. Most received minimal severance payments. The legal administration of the bankruptcy estate would take years to resolve. The Boeing 747 that had been named the Clipper 1T Trippy, the very first 747 Pan Am had ever operated, was auctioned from the tarmac at JFK International Airport on May 12, 1992, with a small group of reporters and former employees present to watch it go. Flight attendants who had spent 20 years building expertise in international service found that their specific skills, the languages, the protocols, the knowledge of foreign cultures and emergency procedures and diplomatic customs were less transferable in an industry increasingly focused on short-haul domestic point-to-point flights. Many were over 45 and found re-employment at equivalent wages impossible. Pilots were luckier. Commercial pilots with Pan Am's hours were sought after. Many moved quickly to Delta, United, American or British Airways. Mechanics, gate agents and administrative staff had harder landings. The day after the closure, the New Haven newspaper The Day ran the headline, "Pan Am takes its final flight into history." Most of the coverage was that day and then it was over. Pan Am failed because over the course of roughly a decade, from the mid-1970s to the mid-1980s, a succession of chief executives made the same category of error. They solved short-term cash problems by destroying long-term competitive assets. William Sewell paid $437 million for national airlines with money the company did not have, creating a debt burden that consumed years of potential recovery and produced almost none of the promised benefits. Edward Acker sold the Pacific routes, the most profitable, most defensible, most historically significant network Pan Am owned, to raise cash that bought perhaps 18 months of additional decline. Every asset sold was another piece of the foundation removed. By the time Thomas Plaskett arrived in 1988, there was very little left to build on. Plaskett was given an impossible task and handled it with more competence than the situation deserved. What almost nobody acknowledged at the time, and what the internal documents make clear in retrospect, was that Pan Am's senior management had understood the structural problem with its lack of domestic routes since at least the mid-1970s. They had 3 years warning before deregulation arrived. They chose national airlines as the solution. The choice itself was not unreasonable. The price was catastrophic. The timing was catastrophic. The integration was catastrophic. 3 catastrophes at once is not bad luck. It is bad judgment. And there is the deepest irony. Pan Am was destroyed, in significant part by the aircraft it had insisted Boeing build. The 747 was the right aircraft for a world in which Pan Am maintained its protected monopoly on international routes, operated from a domestic feeder network that kept its seats filled, and could spread the enormous fixed costs of wide-body operations across a large captive passenger base. Without those conditions, the 747 was simply expensive. Enormous aircraft that cannot be filled consistently are liabilities. Pan Am had built the instrument of the jet age and had then found itself unable to afford to operate it competitively. One Trippy invented the aircraft that defined the era he had created. The era outlasted him and the company together. Today, the address of Pan Am's former headquarters, 200 Park Avenue, Midtown Manhattan, above Grand Central Terminal, houses the MetLife building. The Pan Am letters were removed from the building's facade in September 1992, 9 months after the airline ceased operations. MetLife replaced them with their own logo in neon blue. Some New Yorkers still call it the Pan Am Building, reflexively, out of habit formed over 30 years. Most people in their 20s and 30s today have never heard of Pan Am, let alone connected it to the building above the station they pass through daily. The Miami International Airport campus still houses the Pan Am International Flight Academy, the only operational survivor of the original enterprise. Under the terms of the bankruptcy, the training academy was permitted to remain open independently in 1992, using the flight simulators that had belonged to the airline. It still trains commercial pilots today. The name on the door is the last physical trace of the company that built it. In Dinner Key, Miami, a harbor district south of downtown, the original Pan Am seaplane terminal still stands. It was from this building, with its curved Art Deco facade facing Biscayne Bay, that the China Clipper services were celebrated in the 1930s, where the Martin the 1130 Cess lifted off for Hawaii and the Philippines, and the great adventure of the Pacific air routes. The building is now Miami City Hall. Commissioners hold their meetings in the room where passengers once checked in for flights to Manila. The Pan Am Historical Foundation, headquartered in New York, maintains archives of the company's history. It holds photographs, documents, internal memoranda, and artifacts that represent the full span of the company's 64-year existence. Collectors of Pan Am memorabilia have sustained a secondary market for decades. An original 1969 first-class menu in good condition commands several $100s at auction. The powder blue Pan Am travel bags, carried by millions of passengers through the airports of the world through the 1960s and 1970s, appear at estate sales and are immediately bought. They represent, for the people who buy them, something that has become genuinely hard to articulate: the memory of a world in which flying felt like an event rather than an endurance test. The Boeing 747 that Trippy pressured Bill Allen to build, the aircraft whose development nearly bankrupted Boeing, whose first commercial service Pan Am operated in January 1970, outlasted the company that created it by more than 3 decades. The last commercial passenger 747 service was operated in 2024. Approximately 1,500 aircraft of the type were delivered over 50 years. They carried an estimated 3.5 billion people. The total distance flown by all 747s in commercial service is equivalent to more than 100,000 return trips to the moon. Pan Am invented the aircraft that defined its era. Pan Am did not survive its era. The responsibility for that failure does not rest in any single room or any single decision. William Sewell made the choice to overpay for national airlines. Edward Acker sold the Pacific route. They had every chance to survive. If your father or mother flew Pan Am, if they carried one of those powder blue bags through the terminal at JFK or Frankfurt or Hong Kong, if they were served dinner from China plates on a night crossing over the Atlantic, if they helped load cargo or work the ramp or fly the Pacific routes that Tripp and Lindbergh had opened in the 1930s, then you already know what was lost. Not just a company, a way of doing something, a standard, a belief that the distance between continents could be covered with dignity. What you remember, we want to hear. Tell us in the comments below.